The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations, Secretary, and welcome, Madam Secretary. Appreciate your presence. I just want to make sure I understand the playing field, and in the context that Russia or the USSR in its previous version has been involved in the United States and undermining the United States since 1917, since the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, and the history of the Venona transcripts and recepts show that they infiltrated our government at the very highest levels and influenced policy in magnificent effect in the decades past. But so this is nothing new. But in the current context, Madam Secretary in particular, do we know of, and Secretary, if you know, their incursion into the most recent federal election, the presidential election, they didn't change any of the votes as far as I know, right? That we're talking about information gathering, but I think in the greater sense, we're talking about propaganda and influence operations as opposed to vote tampering or changing. Am I correct in that assessment?
So from the extent of our understanding in 2016, rather the extent of their access was to a voter registration database that was not a vote count. It was well kind of left of voting day. So they were able to get into a state voter registration database and exfiltrate some data.
And their interest in looking at the voter database, so to speak, was to then provide propaganda or information to key voters or to target voters.
I'm not actually sure that was their intent. In fact, I think to a certain extent they didn't know necessarily what they were looking at. They were perhaps mucking around in a system trying to figure out where they had landed and where they were and understand, frankly, how the systems worked and how they interoperated. But to be clear, we did not see them having access to any machines, equipment, or whatever that was involved in vote tallying.
And it's because of the lack of network access and decentralization of the voting system among states that even if they would have wanted to, they figured out where they were and they wanted to influence it. It had been very, very difficult. That's my understanding, but I want to clarify that, or have you clarify.
That's certainly a contributing factor, yes, sir.
Okay. And so at this point, other than access to voter registration, we don't know exactly what their intent was, and they don't at this point admit that they were ever even involved, right? They still don't admit that they were ever involved, but we are fairly confident that they were. Is that correct?
The intelligence community assessment from 2017 was pretty clear that they did intend to interfere. Yes, sir.
But we don't know in what way they.
In what way? Okay. I'd have to go back and do a dig back into the ICA, but.
Okay, and I think that's important to know to inform us of future elections. I don't suspect, since they deny currently that they were even involved, that they will ever admit that they're probably going to try and stay involved and continue to be involved as they have since, for the last 100 years, essentially, right? They're probably going to, so it would be important to know, I would think, to get an assessment of what they were seeking to do if they did, in fact, get in. We should know that so we can safeguard in the future. But let's go to the Countering Foreign Influence Task Force that you talked about regarding propaganda and disinformation. We've got an election coming up in about 4 months. Will that organization be prepared at that time to inform, by whatever method it decides and determines is appropriate, the American public of things like Russia Today or ads on social media, et cetera, to influence via propaganda the American electorate? Will that task force be prepared at that time to be engaged?
So my task force, I wouldn't think of it as an incident response capability. I think of it more of as an analytical cell. See what the activities they do over time, what their tactics, techniques, and procedures are, and build up a body of knowledge to then share, generally speaking. Here are the sorts of things they do. These are the sorts of things that the American public should be on the lookout for. Other agencies have the more tactical response of, we are seeing, for instance, the Internet Research Agency perhaps do activity X, Y, or Z. That is where the FBI becomes involved. That is where other agencies become involved.
Okay, so I think I have a clear understanding of that, but what I'm missing, and I think some other members might be missing, is once we have that information, once we have that track record, then what? Who is going to inform the American people of this advertisement is specifically coming from a propaganda source, whether it's Russia or some other hostile nation or adversarial nation, and to be suspicious of it. Whose job in the federal government or state and local governments is it to do that informing of the citizenry?
So this is in part a government industry collaboration. So where we have social media companies working with government, will be able to identify the information, whether flag it or take it down, similar to terrorist use of the internet, where they remove content, disable accounts. That sort of activity can happen on the private sector side, on the industry side.
So it's planned to happen solely on the private sector?
No, sir. This is truly a partnership. This is going to be the government will be taking certain actions, and then the private sector will be taking certain actions. I think if you look at what Twitter has done over the last week or so, or last couple months, where they've disabled 70 million accounts by press reports at least, I think that's the sort of activity you'll see happening going forward.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield.